Good afternoon, fourth grade. We're going to continue reading in our American Revolution text. Before we get started, we have a warm-up that's to do with author's perspective. So if you want to take out your homeschool journal and turn to your author's perspective page to help you figure this out, you can. It says, at dawn, May Tuck set out on her horse for the wood at the edge of the village of Tree Gap. She was going there as she did once every 10 years to meet her two sons, Miles and Jesse, and she was feeling at ease. At noontime, Winnie Foster, whose family owned the Tree Gap wood, lost her patience at last and decided to think about running away. Okay, and if we stop right here, we need to think, who is telling the story? And so we know the story is about May Tuck, and it's about excuse me, and it's about Winnie Foster, but they are not telling the story. Someone else is telling the story about them. So we know that the author's perspective is third person. And where it says, how do you know, we would say, the narrator is telling the story about May Tuck and Winnie Foster. Press pause to complete the warm-up and play when you're ready for the focus question. It says, how were the American soldiers affected by the early northern battles? Our vocabulary words for today are expedition. That's when you go on like a journey with a group of people. So this would be a picture of an expedition. Brutal, that's being really violent. So we have these football players brutally tackling each other. And wilderness, that is a section of land where people don't live. It's just out in the wild. And we would draw a line to this picture. All right, turn the page, and now we are ready to read. And so the first thing we do with a nonfiction text is we turn that title into a how or why question so that we can find the main idea. And so I came up with, how were American soldiers affected by the early northern battles? Press pause to write down your answer in box 1 and play when you're ready to read. Let's read. Late in 1775, Americans marched against the Canadian towns of Montreal and Quebec to prevent the British Navy from landing a powerful force there. Led by New York Generals Philip Schuyler and Richard Montgomery, the expedition captured Montreal in November and moved against Quebec. Then another expedition commanded by Benedict Arnold of Connecticut crossed the Maine wilderness in a brutal march to join them. But the combined American force was defeated at Quebec and Montgomery was killed. All right, and down here we have a map of their routes. And so Quebec is up here and Montreal is over here, and we've got New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Maine's over here. So when you're in parallel teaching, you can use this map to make better sense of where the colonists were. All right, so for our main idea, how were the American soldiers affected by early northern battles? We know that they marched to Quebec, and they were able to capture Montreal on their way to Quebec. And if you look at this map, Montreal's here and Quebec is farther north. So the colonists were able to capture Montreal before moving to Quebec. So that is a battle that they won. But, and then another group of colonists crossed Maine and met them at Quebec, and they fought together against the British, but they lost at Quebec. And so for our main idea, we would write down, the American soldiers experienced victories and losses in the early northern battles. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for box 2. It says, why did the Americans march against the Canadian towns of Montreal and Quebec? Let me go back in my text. It says, late in 1775, Americans marched against the Canadian towns of Montreal and Quebec. So that tells me what they did. That does not tell me why. So I need to keep reading. To prevent the British Navy from landing a powerful force there. So they were trying to keep the British Navy out of Montreal and Quebec. So they were trying to get there first. And so in 2A, we would write, the Americans marched against the Canadian towns of Montreal and Quebec in order to prevent the British Navy from setting up their forces there. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for 2B. It says, what was the result of the expedition led by Philip Schuyler and Richard Montgomery? And so, if we go back in our text, it says, led by the New York generals Philip Schuyler and Richard Montgomery, the expedition captured Montreal in November and moved against Quebec. So we know that the result was that they captured Montreal. In box 2B, we would write, the expedition, led by Philip Schuyler and Richard Montgomery, resulted in a victory for the American soldiers. They captured Montreal. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for box 3. It says, why did Benedict Arnold lead his troops across Maine? Okay, let's go back in our text. We found Benedict Arnold at the bottom, and it says he crossed the Maine wilderness in a brutal march to join them. Okay, who is he joining? If I go back to the sentence before that, I know he's joining the New York generals, Philip Schuyler and Richard Montgomery. So Benedict Arnold's group of soldiers met Philip Schuyler and Richard Montgomery's soldiers at Quebec so that they could team up to fight against the British. So in box 3A, I would write, Benedict Arnold led his troops across Maine so that he could join American soldiers in order to capture Quebec. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for 3B. What was the result of Arnold's actions? Well, we know that it says, but the combined American force was defeated at Quebec and Montgomery was killed. So we know that they lost. In box 3B, we would write down, Arnold's actions resulted in a loss for American soldiers. They did not capture Quebec from the British soldiers. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for box 4. It says, what is the structure of the text? You need to go back in your homeschool journal to your text structure foldable. And we need to think very carefully about this because I'm not going to give you the answer, okay? But I am going to help you. I'm going to give you a hint. In our questions, it asks us why people did things and what happened as a result. And then in box 3, it asks us why someone did something and then what happened as a result. So you need to go back in your text structure foldable and figure out, which of these text structures explains why people did something and tells us what happened next. And then you need to explain why you think that's the structure of the text. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for the paragraph. And paragraph 4 says, how were the American soldiers affected by the early northern battles? And you can use your main idea and your details from boxes 2 and 3 to write your paragraph.